Hi, I'm Sharaad Kuttan. Welcome to Let's Talk, the show that brings you the most important conversations of the day. Today we're going to be asking ourselves, should books be banned in Malaysia Baru? And to help me answer that question, I have members of G25, a group well known for their views on religion and freedom of speech in the country. I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Noor Farida Arifin, former ambassador, Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif Muhammad Qasim, former KSU of the Ministry of Finance, and also Dr. Sharifah Munira Alatas with UKM Strategic Studies and Security Institute. Thank you all for joining me, and we're going to be talking firstly about the book that you published, Breaking the Silence, Voices of Moderation, Islam in a Constitutional Democracy. It was banned in 2017, and there's talk now about unbanning the book. Farida, could you help us understand, how did this all happen? When I look at the people who contributed to this book, including the present Minister of Education, I'm surprised that this book was banned at all.
Precisely, and we also had a foreword by the former Prime Minister, Tun Abdullah Badawi. In fact, the book was published in 2015, and it was, in fact, we had a formal launching of the book at our first G25 conference on Islam and constitutional democracy, and it was officially launched by Tengku Razali, of course, you know, a stalwart UMNO member. That was in December 2015, about a year after our open letter was published. And as you said, it's a book, it's a collection of articles by Muslim intellectuals and some non-Muslim authors as well. And it has nothing to do with Islamic doctrine. We never touch on issues of Islamic doctrine. It was like Islam, Justice and Equality in Islam by Chandra Muzaffar, as you know, well-known Malaysian intellectual, and by Professor Shad Salim Faruqi. This is about Sharia law within the federal constitution, and then Equality and Justice for Women in Islam by Zaina Anwar, who is former executive director of Sisters in Islam, and now she's executive director of Musawa. So these are intellectual topics, and the book was written, and all the articles were written in English. And Tan Sri also contributed an article on constitution and economy. And as I said, there was nothing anti-Islam in any of the articles in the book.
So how do we explain this? Maybe, Tan Sri, you can help us understand. Were you surprised when news came of the banning of the book?
Yes, of course I was surprised. There was no reason to ban it because it's all intellectual stuff written by well-known international as well as local scholars, not only on Muslim affairs but on constitution.
So who's threatened by it? I mean, because people are threatened by ideas, and the history is replete, and especially in the 20th century, of ideas being actually quite threatening for the powers to be. Munira, help me understand this, because as somebody from the outside looking in, it seems quite bewildering, but there must be something else that's at play that we don't see necessarily.
Well, I think when you say that who is threatened by the openness of the book, or by democratic thinking or intellectual thinking, I think both spectrums. It could be either those who are in power, those who are in civil society as well feel threatened. Because when it boils down to it, I think people are just not very comfortable with different ideas. Basically, we're not open to that yet. And the challenge is to open your mind to new ideas, and intellectuals can offer that. The book offers that.
Okay, so let's go back to the claim that you made, Farida, that the book doesn't touch on questions of doctrine. The question is, then what is it that, if you could speculate, that actually is quite threatening for some people?
The reason given, and in fact, when they banned the book, we were not even aware of it. We learned about the ban through social media and through friends a month later. And the ban was on 14 June 2017, and it was under the Printing Presses and Publications, in brackets, Control of Undesirable Publications Order of 2017. The ban was, of course, by the Minister of Home Affairs on the advice of JAKIM, that the Islamic Federal Islamic Department. And And the reason given was that it was prejudicial to public order. Can you imagine prejudicial to public order a year after 2 years after the book had been in existence and had been circulated? Was there any incident of any street protest or even any single person protesting? But we have this, what you call Bahagian Kawalan Penerbitan and Teks Al-Quran, which is called BKPTQ, and they have been responsible for advising the Ministry of Home Affairs to ban books on Islam or any books which has the name Islam. And in fact, the Sisters in Islam book called Muslim Women and the Challenges of Islamic Extremism was also banned. And that was banned 2 years after it had been in circulation, and it was on the same, for the same reason, prejudicial to public order.
Right, so it is a kind of a default setting when it comes to pushing back on ideas. Munir, help me think this through. I mean, is it possible that what's at stake here is somebody wanting the monopoly of interpretation? They want to control over who gets to talk about the question of Islam in this country.
Yes, definitely. There definitely is a push, and I don't think it's something new. I think it has always been in existence. The fact that we do have a change in government, a new regime, so to speak, we still have that characteristic of wanting to monopolize on ideas.
Right, and we're going to come back to that. But before we go on, Tan Sri, the question of JAKIM that was mentioned earlier, G25 seen as a critic of many of the ways in which the Islamic bureaucracy has worked. Do you think that was part of it? That in fact G25 is seen as a group that is overly critical or of the present Islamic bureaucracy?
Well, the label that's used to describe G25 is that liberal. As you know, the word liberal has become a dirty word in Malaysia. So somebody labeled G25 as liberal, and that I think was the main reason why the book was banned. That is a book written by liberals. Now coming to JAKIM, well, it was established for the purpose of providing coordination, of Islamic practices across the states. But over time, it has become more than that, and it has tended to go into matters that really should come under the purview of the state government. So states have been complaining that JAKIM has been intruding into their powers, and they are beginning to ask questions. What right have JAKIM to impose their views on states to adopt their interpretation of Islamic rules or regulations.
Can I ask you, Farida, have you engaged as a group, G25, with JAKIM? Is there been any attempt to bridge the different perceptions of what each other is doing?
We have, in fact, after the publication of our open letter, we were invited by the DG of JAKIM, the previous DG, and to have a dialogue with them. And in fact, Tan Sri Sharif, Tan Sri Ismail Marika, and myself, we met them in Putrajaya. They gave us a sumptuous dinner, and we had a very good conversation, and we raised our concerns about matters like the body snatching cases. You remember that was the former climber of Everest. When he died, somebody came to JAKIM and said he had converted to Islam by making the pronouncement of Allah is the only one and Muhammad is prophet, and on the basis of that, without further investigation, when the body was being prepared by the family for burial, they snatched the body to give him a Muslim burial.
Right. So all these different things that you brought to them, what was the reception? Were they open to a different perspective?
Well, the thing is, they were very defensive. Their explanation was that, it was incumbent upon them as a Muslim bureaucracy, Muslim agency, to make sure that if people convert to Islam, they're given Muslim burial and all that. And we also raised concerns like, Islamic department officials going to a Hindu wedding and arresting the bride because they said she was a Muslim. Those kind of things, which really gave rise to a lot of concern, a lot of outrage among not just non-Muslims, but also amongst Muslims. But we tried, but unfortunately, I don't think there was a meeting of minds. No, it was a very pleasant meeting, and everybody was very polite and so on. But I think we have our differences, and we have not really resolved them.
Okay, we're going to be back with a deeper look at the issue of how to bridge these gaps. Stay tuned to Let's Talk with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan. With me, Dr. Noor Farida Arifin, also Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif Muhammad Qasim, and Dr. Sharifa Munira Alatas, all of them members of G25. We're talking about the book which was published by G25, Breaking the Silence, Voices of Moderation, Islam in a Constitutional Democracy, that was banned. Been talk lately about unbanning the book, and so we're getting into a deeper dive into the book and what it represents, what this particular case represents. Mira, if I could begin with you, the idea of meeting of minds, very interesting. You work in a public university, you work in a university, intellectuals. Is there that sense that in fact people with very different points of view need to engage with each other? I'm talking about Malaysian intellectual culture.
Yes. Before I answer that, definitely there is always a need for a meeting of minds. In the Malaysian culture, intellectual culture, academic culture, I see that that is lacking. We can blame the government for a lack of freedom of speech or freedom of expression, academic expression. But I fear that even if we are given that freedom, we don't seem to have that culture amongst us. For instance, we have a corridor of maybe 10 offices, 10 rooms. We hardly visit each other in the offices. We hardly engage in conversation, intellectual exchange. Everyone is doing their own thing. So I fear that we're caught in this cauldron of to each his own. There is no exchange of ideas.
But to each his own presumes tolerance of differences, right? I mean, even that would be preferable to an attempt to suppress difference, in this case, suppress a book. Tan Sri, I would ask you if you think that the approach that G25 took was, at least seen in a Malaysian context, as far too strident, too aggressive, that perhaps slowly, gently, behind closed doors might have worked better in terms of putting your concerns across.
I think we believe that the public must know, because far too long I think we've been hiding things, and not willing to talk about it and not willing to bring up the issues into the open. And that was the purpose of the public statement that G25 made on 7th of December 2014, where we said that there is a tendency to interpret Islam in a very restrictive way, to the extent that there is a risk that our personal liberties may be affected. So from that, we keep on raising the question, to what extent should religion play in regulating the ordinary life of Muslims? And that is where our main difference is with JAKIM. JAKIM feels that Sharia law should regulate the life of Muslims. We feel that Muslims, if they commit sins, they have to answer it for them. They have to answer for their own sins to God. It is not the business of state to punish them and to criminalize,
Right. So
Kalwat, or if they walk, a boy and a girl walks in a park, is that a crime? crimes are against society, against property. That is defined in the Constitution. The rest, personal misbehavior, which does not affect the life, which does not threaten the life and security of other people, that should not be punished by law. Yeah.
Right, so this is that classic argument about the difference between private morality and public morality. Is it possible ever to come to some sort of consensus about these distinctions, allowing for issues of, say, fundamental liberties and personal liberties? Do you think that, that in fact there is a consensus on that, or is the state, at least in terms of the bureaucracy, quite convinced that fundamental liberties don't really play an important role?
No, I disagree, because the supreme law of our land is the federal constitution, and fundamental liberties are enshrined in the constitution. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech, personal freedoms, and so on, the right to own property, etc., etc. And even though Article 3 of the Federal Constitution states that Islam is the religion of the Federation, and this is what a lot of Islamists and some of the conservative Muslim NGOs like ISMA are arguing, that that makes Malaysia Islamic state. That is not so, because they completely forget about the second limb, which says, but all other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony in every part of the Federation. And Article 4 then states that the Federal Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and any other law is subordinate to the Federal Constitution. But unfortunately, the Islamists, in fact, List 2 of the Schedule 9 of the Federal Constitution states that basically states assemblies can create laws which are basically family laws, which will govern the lives of Muslims, and they can create and punish precepts against precepts of Islam, crimes against offenses against the precepts of Islam. And under this provision, states have been legislating on criminal laws for Muslims.
So there's actually something in the Constitution that's ambiguous.
No,
on one hand, personal liberties, but also it enables states to actually encroach on those personal liberties.
There's no ambiguity except for the term can create and punish offenses against the precepts of Islam, because it was never defined what are the offenses against the precepts of Islam. But there is a big but, that they cannot emulate, or they cannot create punishments which are already in civil law. So they cannot duplicate any of the offenses in the penal code or any other.
So and this has implications.
Yes.
I do want to come back to the question of moderation, which is something that is part of the discussion with G25, but also it seems to be deployed by politicians. Munir, what do you think, what does moderation actually mean? Is it something that we all have a shared definition of?
I don't think we all have an equal understanding of what moderation is. Some of us, or at least the way I understand it, the way somebody intelligent and open-minded and liberal should understand moderation, is not to be extreme. It's not to go off the tangent. Not to be extreme in terms of religion, for instance. Your idea of what morality is not doing any harm to somebody else, not bringing harm to somebody else. So I think the easy answer is moderation is just not to be extreme, and I think we are unfortunately heading that way. ISMA is an example of not taking the moderate route. So that is my simple answer. It's not a big, it's not rocket science, let's say.
Okay, it's not rocket science, but we obviously don't have a consensus on it. We'll be back with a deeper look at this controversy swirling around the banning of a book, Breaking the Silence, Voices of Moderation, Islam in a Constitutional Democracy, published by the G25 group. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan. With me, Dato' Noor Farida Arifin, also Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif Muhammad Qasim, and Dr. Sharifah Munira Alatas, all members of G25, a group that published some years ago a book titled Breaking the Silence, Voices of Moderation, Islam in a Constitutional Democracy. The book was banned subsequently, and now there's talk that the book might be unbanned. But we're trying to use that as a kind of way into the larger question of intellectual freedom in this country, the administration of Islam, and then of course institutions like JAKIM that have been given the task of administrating the religion but have become a kind of government within government. I think that's something that the G25 was also suggesting. So let's spend some time looking at JAKIM as an institution, and I know there's been some pushback on it. Maybe I could ask you, Tan Sri, how do you see it going forward? We've had some monarchs like the Sultan of Johor making critical remarks about JAKIM. We've also had questions about the enormous budget that JAKIM has. Under this new government, do you see a shift in a view of the federal agency, and also how to perhaps deal with some of the more controversial practices coming out of that agency?
We haven't had a clear idea yet what the present government wants to do with JAKIM, but I think they would like to see JAKIM concentrate on activities that are useful for Muslims. And we do admit in our book, which is coming out sometime this year, we are writing a book on the administration of Islam, and in that book we talk about the role of JAKIM. There are a few good things that JAKIM does for Muslims, and we are not against that, but we don't think that Muslims should go to the extent of trying to regulate our daily life to the extent that we lose all the fundamental liberties mentioned in the Constitution.
Right, Munira, because there have been individuals who have argued that JAKIM should be disbanded, saying that in fact the administration of the religion ought to be left to the states. What's your position on this argument?
Well, I actually do feel that the administration of religion should be left to the state. I see this. I don't see the usefulness of having JAKIM. That is my profound belief.
Okay, is that a view shared broadly among the G25 members?
Yes, because the book that Tan Sri mentioned, we did a lot of research into the administration of Islam and also the establishment of JAKIM, and we discovered that under the federal constitution, the establishment of JAKIM is in fact against the constitution. It's illegal, because under the constitution, Islam is a state matter, and that's why the rulers are questioning, the existence of JAKIM, because now JAKIM has spread its tentacles to also cover the states, when it should simply be confined to, its jurisdiction should be confined to the federation.
Now,
right.
So the pushback like this is quite interesting, because any government, including the new government, will have to deal with a charge that in fact they're dismantling a major Islamic institution. Now, do you think this government, looking for, I mean, it's only been 8 months since they've been constituted, do you think they have the political will to deal with the issue of JAKIM?
Well, it's going to be a very sensitive issue, especially in view of the fact that the opposition, UMNO and PAS, are playing up, race and religion and trying to convince Malays, especially, that PH government is anti-Islam and they are the only champions of Islam and champions of the Malays and so on. If there's any attempt by the government to do this, I'm sure they will organize street demonstrations just like they did with ICED, for example, which is International Convention Against Racial Discrimination. So the government will have to play this very carefully. And before if there's any intention that is to disband JAKIM, there has to be public consensus, and they would have to consult widely, I believe.
Right. So this would have to be a large kind of conversation. And
Yeah.
to what extent is G25 reaching out beyond the circles? Because of course you're all senior civil servants or academics, part of the kind of Malaysian elite, I mean intellectual elite. Do you feel that your message, Tan Sri, reaches out to the grassroots? Does it have any resonance with ordinary people?
Well, I must admit, to the grassroots, no, I think limited. But I would like to mention that when the new government came in, they formed the Institutional Reforms Committee under that big, we call the Council of Eminent Persons. So we appeared before the committee and we made a representation. And we talked about the administration of Islam. And then the rulers established a committee to also look into the issue about administration of Islam in the country. And we made the presentation there too. I believe that the rulers formed that committee because they too want to see what are the views of civil society about, let's say, the issue of JAKIM, the issue of hudud. And we were able to give a lengthy presentation, I think more than 2 hours, because we have done studies on this, and we are in the process of completing our book. And the views that we presented are the same as what we have been talking in this talk show.
Right. Munira, you work with a lot of young people, and I wonder if there's also a generational divide here. The young people that you meet, will these arguments and the questions resonate with them? Or what is in working in a public university, what's the sense that you have of the different viewpoints that exist among very young Malaysians who are kind of just coming into adulthood?
Well, from what Farida, you and I were talking just a few minutes ago, there's a tendency to believe in fake news. Unfortunately, among the young people, there seems to be a tendency to believe in something that is sensational. And even among the students, you would expect them to involve themselves in more research, to engage in more unfake conversation, to consult their lecturers about what is really the truth out there. Unfortunately, that's not happening. That's not taking place. The other thing that I find among the young people, at least the undergraduate students and even some postgraduate students, there is also a very acute feeling that there is a difference in the races, that there is the us and the them. And over the last 16 years that I've been in academia, I can see that this feeling is getting worse. So there is more of a divide. So I'm not very optimistic about the future generation.
Right. Okay, and finally, we could just very quickly, Farida, if you could just help us understand, with this present government, are you engaging to help them also negotiate with the Minister Mujahid Yusuf Rawa? Do you see an openness that wasn't there before?
Oh yes, very much so. In fact, I'm very optimistic about the future under this new government. I feel that they are walking the talk. And the very first thing they did was to, as Tan Sri mentioned, form the Eminent Persons Council, and also the Institutional Reforms Committee, headed by my former colleague, Datuk K.C. Bora, and the members were Datuk Ambika Srinivasan, Professor Shad Salim Faruqi, and so on. And they consulted, they got feedback from CSOs across the board, including us, about our views for institutional reforms. And in fact, we dealt with them at length, and we also gave them our material, because 2 years ago we had a publication which was called, what was it, Tan Sri? Invigorating Economic Confidence in Malaysia, where some of our recommendations was about strengthening reform in the government, to promote independent judiciary, good governance, independent judiciary, blah, blah, etc., etc. So I'm very optimistic. And in fact, talking about the Minister for Religious Affairs, we've had a dialogue with him. He invited us to have a dialogue with him about the concerns that we've mentioned. And it was a very good, it was a very good conversation that we've had with him. And I'm very optimistic that he will do what is necessary. He and together with the Minister of Education, they will do what is necessary to make sure that they tackle, that all these issues are addressed, especially issues like the influence that extremist Muslim organizations are having on the young people and so on. Issue of racial polarization that Munira talked about. So I'm very optimistic. And the very fact, Sharaad, that, you know, PH government won GE14 because many young people who believe in openness, who believe in democratic government, and who believe in Malaysia's future voted for change.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll be back. We'll take a short break. We'll see you in a moment. Hi, welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan. With me, Dr. Sharifah Munira Alatas, also Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif Muhammad Qasim, and also Dato Noor Farida Arifin, all members of G25. Munira, I'll turn to you, and again, the young people that you talk about, because I think, as you rightly pointed out, it was, we are expecting a country that's going to be changed by this particular generation. If the government gets its way and reduces the voting age, then it's actually this generation that's going to play a huge role in the next general election. The question of the us and them, right? Does the us in the kids that you speak to define themselves in a way that's exclusivist? Do they see themselves as so separate that the idea of a plural society, of tolerance, of finding spaces for individuals, something unpalatable?
Well, I will give two scenarios. The first scenario is my role as an academic at UKM. Majority of the students are from the civil service, and also the graduate students, that is. The undergraduates are of the majority are of one race. I would say 80 to 90% are Malay. So definitely they do see themselves as the majority. They are the majority race. The others, the other 20% who are the non-Malays and the non-Muslims, they do isolate themselves. In class, they isolate themselves. In a class of 35, let's say, there may be one or two non-Malays. There's hardly any interaction. I'm not sure if this is deliberately done. It seems to be a natural behavior amongst them, and I attribute it to their education experience over the last 10 to 20 years or 12 years, let's say.
Have we been making a conservative, exclusivist, you know, kind of society? Tan Sri, do you mix with a lot of young people? Do you know how they think about the world, and do they see themselves as conservative? Do they want a society run by a divine plan, whoever it is that might interpret it?
Yeah, I do meet a lot of young people, and also have a lot of conversation on the various WhatsApp groups where I give my views about what this country really needs to do. I like just to say that, you know, because of my background in Ministry of Finance, in Economic Planning Unit, I always stress the most important thing I think the government can do for the future generation is to ensure that we have a strong economy. But to have a strong economy, you know, you need good governance, because the world today is very competitive. Countries which can show good governance will create the confidence for investors to come in. And I think this is where I think I'm very pleased that in our interactions with the Speaker of Parliament, with the Electoral Commission's people, and with the Chief Justice of Malaysia, and I can see that they are trying to push very hard for the reform to really take place. And if that is the case, I think Malaysia has an excellent future.
Okay, but you could have an affluent, well-run economy and government, and yet be conservative, right? Conservatism is a different order of things, isn't it? I mean, does affluence and prosperity necessarily mean people will become more moderate in their views about the individual, about society? Is conservatism always about people who feel economically marginalized or deprived?
Not necessarily, but I think it all boils down, as Munira said, to our education system. Because as you can see, if you look at the statistics, the national schools, they're mainly attended by one ethnic group, which is the Malays. Because there is this tendency to have a lot of religious classes, Muslim religious classes, in the school curriculum. And they're bringing in more and more religion into national schools. You have, the azan being sounded out at every prayer session and so on. And this is very off-putting to the non-Muslim parents. And more of them are either the affluent ones send their children to public schools, or the less affluent ones send their children to Chinese schools or non-national schools anyway. And this is contributing again to the racial polarization. Children are simply not mixing, children of various races, not mixing with one another. But the religious conservatism, unfortunately, this is being promoted by our preachers. And the government should really take heed of the fact, and many of the preachers, especially the old ones, they're not very well educated. And most of them don't even have SPM qualification. And if we want to have preachers and so on, we must make sure that they at least have a basic degree, and they go to very good Islamic universities, and not to the Wahhabi universities of Medina or even in Jordan.
Okay, we're going to have Wahhabism is a huge topic that we could have a whole show on that. But I do want to ask you, Munira, I mean, when you talk about social change, right? And we see government. In many ways, we assume that government is an agent for social and cultural change. New government potentially putting Malaysia back on track, if that's the metaphor that you prefer. But is it that simple? How do you address the concerns of a conservative society and get them to think differently about living in a plural, society?
I think, yes, government is the agent of change. But on the other hand, society also has to see government as that agent of change. Conservative society, on the other hand, is going to find a lot of fault, whether it's an old government or the new government. Especially now in our case, the new government they seem threatening to the conservative society that we still have. I think the only way is for the government to reach out to those within civil society who are not conservative. People like us in G25, academics there are a few out there who have regular columns, who write for social media, who manage to reach the young people at least. These young people still have families back in rural Malaysia. That's the way it's going to be spread. That's the way conservatism hopefully can be overcome. But it's never just top down. It's an interaction both ways.
Right, okay. We'll take a short break. We'll be back soon with Let's Talk. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad. Kuttan with me, Dr. Noor Farida Arifin, also Tan Sri Mohammed Sharif Muhammad Qasim, and Dr. Sharifa Munira Alatas, all members of G25. We're looking at the ban of their book, Breaking the Silence, Voices of Moderation, Islam in a Constitutional Democracy. A lot of talk now that this this book might be unbanned, as it weren't permitted for general circulation. I do want to go to the question of G25. Many people might not know, although I think you're all very well known as an organization. You look at Islam, you also look at questions of good governance, as you said, Tan Sri, just now. Also, many ambassadors among you, of course, a former ambassador. Question of foreign affairs. Munira, tell us about that side of the work of G25, getting Malaysians to think about the world, because a lot of the conflicts in the world feed back into Malaysians, especially this idea of being victimized, the idea, and that also drives the conservative agenda, isn't it?
Yes, I think, in fact, very recently that has become more of an issue now because of the crisis in the Yemen, for instance. The previous defense minister had deployed in Ops Yemen 2, had deployed some of Malaysian forces.
On the side of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its allies.
And its allies. And to me and many members who think like G25, we feel that it was illegally done. And as well as the war in the Yemen does not concern foreign countries. It started off as a civil war. Now we have countries like Iran and Saudi and the Saudi coalition interfering in the issue. And why is Malaysia sending troops there, if not to support the Saudi coalition? My conclusion is because the world now sees the conflict as a Sunni-Shia issue and not not as a social, economic problem and a civil, a domestic issue. It has become a religious issue. It's no longer an economic issue.
In which the government of Malaysia feels the need to stake claim on one side as opposed to the other. The previous government. Okay, the previous government. So help us understand. I understand that you are going to be holding a seminar next month. Symposium on Yemen. Is it to influence the government policy on this? What kind of engagement do you have with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?
Well, so far, the purpose of the symposium, Stand for Yemen Symposium, is to engage the public, to engage basic, ordinary Malaysians with foreign affairs issues of Malaysia, and also to open the eyes of Malaysians that the Muslim world, in this case Yemen, we need to give some attention to it, not just because it is a Muslim country, but because violation of human rights have been committed.
And there's a major humanitarian crisis
as well. It is a
humanitarian
crisis, and it is being fed by Saudi Arabia and the coalition. Malaysians should realize that Saudi Arabia shouldn't be supported in this case.
But Farida, isn't there, I mean, among nation states, these calculations on who to support and which side to be on and who's got either the geopolitical heft or money, you know, in order to choose your side. I mean, most governments are pragmatic and they're realists when it comes to questions of foreign affairs.
Unfortunately, yes, but our government has always stood for the side of right where foreign affairs are concerned. Unfortunately, the previous government chose the wrong side because it's a huge humanitarian crisis as it is, as you said, and we had no business supporting the aggressors. You know, children are dying of cholera, dying of all kinds of diseases. They imposed a ban, a blockage on the only port, you know, where they're receiving, where the UN and other agencies are trying to send food and medicine and so on.
I might add, excuse me, I might add that the Saudis actually had targeted food producing areas in the Yemen. And that, so the issue is not just the blockade of the ports, but there were targeted bombings of food producing areas.
Okay, so this brings us back to the question of why have we taken the side of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in this conflict?
Previous government. I have to say.
The previous government, right?
Not
so
the current,
and
yeah.
not we, maybe they.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
But there is an issue of the influence, and you mentioned Wahhabism, and in fact, in the recent conflict, it's a storm in a teacup, in a perilous teacup, over the sacking of the imams. There's also this idea of Wahhabism and Salafism being promoted, through the influence of the big money of Saudi Arabia. Tan Sri, is that something that G25 is looking at? The foreign influence in the spread of different interpretations of the religion in the country?
Yeah, of course. I think definitely we cannot deny the fact that there is a lot of foreign influence on the way Islam is interpreted in the country. As you know, we are a Sunni country, but there is the mainstream Sunni and there is the conservative Sunni. Now we in Malaysia, I think most of us believe in the mainstream Sunni, which is not extreme, which is more suited to the cultural values that we have in Malaysia. But the fact is that there are some states, some muftis, who believe that we should adopt the same values that they have in, let's say, in Saudi Arabia, which is not acceptable to us in G25 because we are Malaysia. We live in a under a democratic institution, and we don't like to mix Islamic laws, make Islamic laws the basis of our legal system. The two are separate.
Right. I want to ask you, the remaining time we have, Munira, do you think that sometimes the media doesn't play a sufficient role in that? Because Salafist has become a kind of clickbait as well, and for people interested in that kind of news, right? Do we really understand what the Salafist influence in Malaysia might be for just people's social relations and relations within the Islamic community itself?
I think there is more, in this country at least, in Malaysia, there seems to be more the adopting of the dress, a particular way of dressing. Greetings now. We're using more and more Arab words, discarding with our own traditional Bahasa terms. So it's a superficial transformation, really, among the general public. But it's up to us educators, the intellectuals, the academics, and us in G25 as well as the public universities. We have the most influence on the general public in that sense. So it is just a superficial form of Salafism that has spread among the general public. But having said that, we have the muftis, we have the imams in the mosques during Friday prayer with their form of indoctrination. So let's not just talk about China and their indoctrination of the Uyghurs. We're having the indoctrination here as well.
Okay, and the Uyghur, another big issue, we should actually have a show on that. It's a huge problem, I think, for the globe in dealing with China and its policies against its Uyghur Turkmen minority. In the remaining seconds that we have, Farida, thank you very much again. What is it that you would like us to be mindful of with this new government on the questions that are concerned G25?
Well, as we said, they're still having the honeymoon period, and we're seeing some, they're not really adhering to most of the pledges that they made in the manifesto. So the role of civil society now is to monitor them closely and to remind them of their promises, especially on institutional reform, and especially on the establishment of the Public Complaints Commission, Police Public Complaints Commission, which they promise they will be tabling, in the next sitting of Parliament. So the role of civil society, I think now, is to monitor the government closely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining me. I've been speaking to Dr. Farida Arifin, former ambassador. Also Tan Sri Mohammad Sharif Mohammad Qasim, former KSU Ministry of Finance, and Dr. Sharifah Munira Alatas with UKM. This has been Let's Talk with me, Sharaad Kuttan, only on Astro Awani.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.